Welcome to our October Ask UAS presentation, Zombies, the Apocalypse Within Us. We are so excited for Dr. Matthew Pawlus' presentation. Before we start, I'm going to tell you a few words about our campus library. For those of you that don't know, we're open to the public, so you don't have to be a student to come in and use the building or check things out. We also are part of the same consortium as the public library, which is kind of a highfalutin way of saying that your First City Libraries card, if you have one of these, it works here. And even if you don't have it with you, we can look you up in our computer because we use the same computer system. So please feel free to come in when we're open and, check out our materials. So let's see, you've made yourselves at home. Hopefully you've grabbed some snacks. If you haven't, you can make a break for it, or you can wait until the end. We ask that you please turn your cell phones on silent. And on your way out, if you're not on our email list, we have an email list and we can let you know. We only email like once or twice a month, just an update of what's coming up next. So let me tell you a little bit about our new Assistant Professor of Science. Matthew is a molecular biologist joining UAS most recently from Black Hills State University in Spearfish, South Dakota. After earning his doctorate in molecular biology from the University of Colorado and working in the field of cancer biology, he completed his postdoctoral work in stem cells and regenerative medicine at the University of Washington. Matthew has wide-ranging interests, academic and otherwise, that include biotechnology, genetic manipulation, geology, marine biology, nutrition, brewing, which is awesome, cycling, and any and all outdoor activities. He also has a fantastic sense of humor, because what I'm going to read you next is what else he wanted you to know about him. He's a Sagittarius. His favorite color is teal. He enjoys long walks on the beach, rain or shine, as long as he's observing intertidal creatures. And along with his family, he looks forward to meeting more of the great people of Ketchikan and enjoying more of the amazing natural beauty here. So please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Matthew Pawlus.
Cool, well, thanks for coming. It's good to see so many zombie files in the room. And I looked it up, zombie files is the correct term. I made a mistake with necrophilia before, but we'll avoid that one here. So yeah, thanks for coming to this talk. It's going to be a fun one. You'll hopefully learn a little bit along the way as well. I am a biologist, so I'll try to talk a little bit more about the science behind zombies, but we'll also include a little bit of historic perspective and otherwise in here. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump into it. The great thing about zombie talks is I guess true of any monster talk, but everybody's got sort of an idea of what a zombie is in your head already. So everyone has some expectations about what I'm going to talk about, as well as some problems and questions I'm sure you hope I answer. So I'll do my best to get to all of those, but yeah, let's just see where we end up. So part of the reason why zombies are so popular in our day-to-day life is because they've been with us for a long time. So the first recorded instance of a zombie is actually from a manuscript about 5,000 years old called The Descent of Ishtar. This is a Sumerian text. It gives you this little passage about raising up the dead and bringing them to the world of the living and eating the living, which is pretty zombie apocalypse style writing. And this adaptation was probably adapted from an even earlier story about a Akkadian goddess going to the underworld and threatening to bring back zombies. So the idea of a zombie has really been with us for at least as old as recorded history has been, probably longer. The word zombie, if you're not familiar with its origins, don't feel bad because it's actually hard to pin down. It of course comes from, most commonly it's attributed to Haitian zombies who are practicers of voodoo. The zombie is sort of this undead person who's brought back to life, reanimated by a master magician called a bokor. In 1819 is the first use of this word actually in English language by a poet called Robert Southey. Sounds like my kind of poetry. It'd be interesting. The Oxford English Dictionary, it defines the roots of this word as West African, and potentially it can come from the Congo words for zombie, meaning God, or zumbi, which I like, meaning fetish. So it seems to be in line with a lot of the way we think about zombies today. So almost as a fetish or obsession. All right. So yeah, we have this fascination with zombies. We don't seem to be willing to let the idea of the zombie go from our popular culture. And yeah, there's different theories as to why this is. But one thing, a delineation I want to make first off, is the difference between the zombie and the idea of the zombie apocalypse. So these are actually two different ideas, and we can almost trace back the origins of the zombie apocalypse idea to arising out of stories that arose after World War II. So it's thought that basically after observing all the destruction and lack of humanity that happened during World War II across much of Europe, humans basically had a bleak outlook on the future and the future of the human race. And they started fabricating these stories about the world ending in this sort of gradual destruction of human values that turned into what we call the zombie apocalypse. So you can say that zombie apocalypse is sort of a coping mechanism that people developed in order to deal with this sort of negative feeling about the future. So zombies, they've been with us for a long time, and they're sort of like this nice, emotionally supportive friend. They give us an idea to sort of, or the opportunity to fictionalize a scary future. Yeah, that can definitely be beneficial to us as individuals. So regardless of the reason why the zombies or zombie apocalypse are with us today, we can find examples of them, of course, in all different types of art and media everywhere. So print art, classic literature, modern literature, all these you find examples of basically beings coming back from the dead, being reanimated. Of course, movies, television shows. It's hard to find a television show with without at least one zombie-themed episode. My personal favorite, a ice zombie king riding a zombie ice dragon. If you're not watching Game of Thrones, you're missing out. Even different genres of music have capitalized on the zombie idea. And it reaches into social events as well. So there's all different kinds of instances of zombie runs or zombie 5Ks. You can also go on zombie pub crawls if you're in cities. Basically, you dress up like zombies, crawl through the streets, and go from bar to bar. So at the end of the day, I'm guessing you're pretty much recapitulating sort of a zombie apocalypse. There's zombie weddings, zombie festivals, pretty much anything you can think of that you could apply zombies to. There's examples of some social event that you can find going on in your area. So I just moved to Ketchikan pretty frequently, but if there's a zombie page on Facebook or something, let me know, and maybe we can get some of these events together. Academia also has not been immune to the zombie craze. You find instances of zombies used in all types of publications. The idea of a zombie apocalypse has been modeled using mathematical models to tell you, the best ways to survive a zombie apocalypse, how likely this is to spread to your town. It's also used as an example by the CDC, so the Center for Disease Control basically uses a zombie apocalypse model to train communities how to respond to an infectious disease threat, which is a fun way to spend a weekend. There's also been publications, of course, about nutritional needs of zombies, as well as analyzing even real estate trends, how they would be affected by a zombie apocalypse as well. But yeah, scientists are just like anybody else. We are fascinated with these creatures and try to work them into our work, whatever that may be. All right, and this brings us to the question behind this talk here. Yeah, I've been teaching biology for a little bit, and before that I've been working in research, biological research, and along the lines I've met a lot of interesting people, and a lot of students especially tend to approach me with questions about zombies. So because maybe they're exposed to all these different forms of zombies in their media, they're of course naturally curious about the science that might be behind actual zombies. So questions have included lots of things, including how could I start a zombie apocalypse? Is it possible to survive by eating just brains? Any diseases that might mimic zombies? Where's the best place to go? Can zombies swim? And of course, will this be on the final as well? So yeah, these are all valid questions. And for the purpose of this talk, I've sort of boiled it down to a little general question. First off, do zombies exist? And we'll look at some examples of possible zombies, and we'll talk about some means at the end of maybe how I modify those zombies to create our own sort of custom zombie apocalypse. But yeah, I always try to sort of be motivated by my students' interests, and yeah, like I said, I was also interested in zombies, so I get to make talks like this. So I guess I have the students to thank for that. All right, so begins my journey into the world of zombies. I set off to basically find out what I could, what's known about zombies, and what we can basically learn from these creatures that I could apply to my classrooms. So give me a reason to talk about them in class. So the first thing I noticed was that although we all have a picture of what a zombie is, there's actually huge variations in the definition of zombies. So if you've ever seen more than one zombie movie or read more than one book about zombies, you know pretty much every time something new comes out, there's an additional change to the zombie stereotype. So it's not as simple as just saying, is something a zombie or not? I actually started making a list of different types of zombies and quickly gave up. I found that there was all these different types. In literature and movies and TV shows, you could find examples of fast zombies, slow zombies, corpse zombies, disease zombies, contagious zombies, non-contagious ones, cursed zombies, drug-induced zombies, human zombies, animal zombies, alien zombies, which are my favorite, occult zombies, and all different types. And as I moved through the literature on the internet, I found that I wasn't the first person to try to classify zombies or look for a good definition. There's actually this graphic, which is beautiful on the right up here. I think you can actually purchase this online, but somebody actually created this little taxonomy of zombies. So it's a phylogenetic tree actually breaking down different types of zombies that have been presented in pop culture. So each of these branches, you can basically see variations of zombies. There's dead zombies, alive ones, fast, slow, all the things I talked about and more. At the end of each of these branches, they give you an example of where you can find that type of zombie in some sort of media. So by doing this and looking at this sort of a tree, I was able to find out that there's probably more than about 350 different types of zombies out there, which is amazing, but pretty complex if you're trying to define what a zombie is. So for my studies, I tried to make it as easy on myself as possible, and I really narrowed this list down to three what I considered to be sort of generally accepted tropes of zombies. So three things I would look for in my definition to fulfill the definition of a zombie. The first being some evidence of cannibalism or violence in a creature. Also, I included loss of higher brain function. Now this can vary depending on your idea of a zombie, but especially important to my research would have been any change in an animal's free will. So you'd look for this in animals that weren't humans by obviously looking for changes in their day-to-day behavior that were resulted from infection with some sort of zombie agent. Also infectivity. So you can't have a zombie apocalypse unless you can sort of pass on your zombiness to somebody else. All right, so in essence, this is the equation I'm going to use to sort of identify zombies. If we've got all three of these attributes, that gives us a zombie, according to my definition. So let's get into it. I approached that listing of 350 different zombie subtypes and started breaking them down into different classes. I settled on just three main classes of zombies that I could group most of these types into. The first type that I'm going to talk about here was what I called psychological zombies. Yeah, you can see the little quote down here from the Cranberries. Great song, but of course, like the name suggests, these are zombies where their behavior is pretty much resulting from some sort of psychological disorder. It didn't take long for people to realize that, especially in rural parts of the world, including Haiti, where a lot of these zombies were reported to originate from, any individual that suffered from some sort of ill-classified psychological behavior, so something like dementia or schizophrenia, it wouldn't take much for these individuals to be labeled as zombies in their culture. So a lot of the zombie stories that came out of Haiti were pretty much attributed to possibly being just stories of relatives or people on the outskirts of society that became afflicted with some sort of mental disorder. So a little bit like we think of homeless people today. A lot of them have mental disorders. They're not in mainstream society. Most of us try to stay away from them and avoid getting bitten, but same thing applies to these types of psychological zombies. However, there were a few psychological disorders that were a little bit more specific to the zombie stereotypes. So the one that's used the most often as an example of a zombie-type psychological disorder is one called Wendigo psychosis. So in Wendigo psychosis, individuals basically develop this psychosis that makes them believe that they're possessed by the spirit of a creature called a Wendigo. It's a little bit like lycanthropy, where you believe you're sort of going to be a werewolf. In this case, you believe you're going to be a Wendigo. And unfortunately for everybody else in this individual's social circles, Wendigos have bad habits, including cannibalism and violence. So individuals who thought they had this disorder or thought they were possessed by a Wendigo would adapt these behaviors and start to brutally murder and eat people. Fortunately, this was a disorder that was pretty much only reported to affect members of Native American tribes who held a belief in the Wendigo, mainly Algonquian tribes, so tribes anywhere from most northeastern U.S. Into Canada, up over there. And this disorder has sort of waned in popularity as these areas have become more urbanized. But there are some historical records. They go back a long way, so this isn't a disorder that you're going to encounter in many modern settings. In the 1600s, there was a group of Jesuit missionaries moving through the Native American villages trying to make converts of Native Americans, and they reported to their superiors in this journal about a village they encountered full of men afflicted with this type of psychosis. They were basically violent individuals. They were pouncing on people. They were eating women and children. Apparently their group was also attacked by one of these, and they had to shoot one. They didn't say if it had to be a headshot or anything like that, but unfortunate incidents. These publications have since their publications sort of come under scrutiny as to how accurate they actually were. Of course, this was a long time ago, and it may just be an account of people running out of food or maybe trying to fight off these missionaries. However, there was a little more recent case of Wendigo psychosis documented in 1878. There was a trapper. He was from the Cree people. He was living outside Alberta with his family at the time, and during the winter, he killed and cannibalized his wife and 5 children, despite the fact that he wasn't that far from some readily available food supplies. So he was probably about 10-20 miles away from some sort of outpost that could have provided food for him. So it's thought that his motivations were probably due to his feeling that he might have been possessed by some sort of Wendigo spirit. So it's often attributed to Wendigo psychosis. So if we look at Wendigo psychosis and psychological disorders as a whole, we can definitely have instances where these disorders can increase violence and even cannibalism of the people afflicted by them. I checked off inhibition of free will because these people, in most cases, aren't choosing to cannibalize their family. They're just feeling like they have no choice because it's the evil spirit inside them. But of course, these disorders aren't really contagious. So it's not a good candidate for zombies or a zombie apocalypse, unfortunately. All right. So it brings us to our second type of zombie, which I called pharmacological zombies. So can you basically take some drugs and become a zombie? Now, there's several different examples of this that we'll talk about, but I thought we'd start at the classic example. Again, going back to the classical Haitian zombie. So back in the 80s, an ethnobotanist from Harvard called Wade Davis, he went to Haiti, he studied zombies, how they were made, and their behavior, and he came back and published a book where he gave a recipe for how to make a zombie. His recipe was actually fairly simple. It pretty much had 2 different powders. You mix these powders together, get them into the bloodstream of somebody who's alive, and presumably they would become a zombie. The powders that he mixed together, the first one had a nice French name, Coupe de Poudre. My French is not anywhere where it should be, but it's a powder that contained a toxin from blowfish called tetrodotoxin. Its purpose was to basically mimic the symptoms of death. And powder 2 didn't really give it a name, so I just call it powder number 2. It included toxins from a plant called Datura, which is a fairly common species. And this plant was basically supposed to mimic sort of hallucinatory psychological effects, making an individual a little bit more pliable and susceptible to being a slave. We can look at these ingredients a little bit more closely. Tetrodotoxin, it doesn't just occur in pufferfish. You can actually find it in a lot of different marine creatures. Sea stars, so not all sea stars, but some sea stars will have this toxin. Moon snails also have it, so I found pieces of moon snail shells around here. They're a big deal in Seattle. They devastate mussel beds and things like that, but moon snails have tetrodotoxin inside them. Some worms do as well. It's actually not produced by these creatures. It's made by a bacteria that lives sort of symbiotically within these creatures. So in essence, they're sort of infected by almost a zombie parasite as well. This bacteria is from the genus Pseudomonas. It's a very potent toxin. It can kill you faster than cyanide. It acts by basically disrupting the communication between your brain and your body. So it's a sodium channel blocker, and you end up getting basically numbness, loss of sensation, muscle paralysis, which unfortunately includes the muscles that allow you to breathe. So eventually, if you get enough of this, you can suffocate by basically not being able to breathe. So yeah, it's maybe in the right dose, this might mimic some symptoms of death. You'd probably get slowed breathing for sure, and maybe loss of sensation. So it's looking okay. Datura, which was an ingredient of that second powder in the mix. It's actually a fairly common flower. It goes by a lot of names. It's depending on where you live, it might have been called Jimson weed or devil's trumpet, thorn apple, moonflower sometimes. It contains tropane alkaloids, which include things like atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. Some of these are actually used as pesticides. And so they can be pretty unpleasant if you take these. However, Datura is a fairly popularly used herbal remedy in a lot of different parts of the world, probably because it does grow in so many different places. A lot of the Navajo use this in American Southwest. It plays a role in some sort of traditional Indian medicine as well. Sometimes it's used as a aphrodisiac, so feel free to give that a try. I don't recommend it. It can be dangerous, especially if you're a child. So you got to avoid eating these without knowing what they are. One of the interesting side effects of these compounds is delirium, so an inability to distinguish between reality and fantasy, which of course would play into the zombie sort of almost existing in a schizophrenic-like state. You also see increased body temperature, irregular heartbeats, crazy violent behavior, photophobia, and amnesia as well. So all those could basically, when mixed with that tetrodotoxin, it sounds like a good combo where it could mimic the symptoms of death, as well as create a sort of pliable nature in the individual, so they're susceptible to suggestion. So you could create your own zombie slave. However, I guess not surprisingly, scholars in the ethnobotany field pretty abruptly dismissed Wade Davis's claims. They claimed he was basically just trying to publish some books, and his accounts of these toxins being used was giving a little too much credit to the Haitian locals. So this story of using these two powders to make a zombie pretty much is academically dismissed. However, Wade Davis points out that nobody's actually really tried to use his powders, and the main reason being one of the ingredients that we didn't talk about in that powder number 2 happens to be freshly buried child's brain. So not surprisingly, nobody really wanted to dig up a child's brain to test out his ideas. So I guess we'll never know. Another form of pharmacological zombie that's been popularized in media erroneously is the use of bath salts. Bath salts have nothing to do with the salts you dump in your tub, so don't go home and eat them. They probably also would not be good for you. It's what's called a designer drug. But it's basically a synthetically made chemical called cathinones. You can find endogenously occurring cathinones in this cot plant. But basically, chemists look at that structure of that compound and then make their own sort of custom blend of that. And before you think about going out this weekend and trying a new party drug, I urge you to look at the symptoms associated with bath salts. Of course, headache is the least of your problems. You're having heart palpitations, nausea, hallucinations, paranoia, violent behavior, heart attack, kidney failure, and liver failure. And suicide, increased pain tolerance, dehydration, breakdown of your skeletal muscle, dilated pupils, involuntary muscle movement, and rapid heartbeat. So it's not a very good or pleasant sounding drug to try out. I'm not sure why people give it a shot, but some people do. And bath salts were initially blamed on being used as an agent that motivated this 2012 Miami cannibal attack, where Rudy Eugene attacked another man named Ronald Edward Popo. He basically ate part of his face off. Rudy Eugene was shot by the police during the attack, and afterwards an autopsy showed there's basically no trace of bath salts in this guy's system. All they found was a trace amount of marijuana. So we're still unsure what really motivated that attack. But oftentimes people say that bath salts were the culprit, and they actually weren't. And actually some of my students the other day said that there's now a new version of a drug called Flocka that's appeared in Florida. And I looked it up, and Flocka is just another name for these bath salts. Basically, they made one of the compounds illegal in bath salts, and chemists tweaked it a little bit, and now it's called flocka. So same thing. It does cause crazy behavior, but probably not going to make you a zombie cannibal. So yeah, for the category of pharmacological zombies, we checked off, yes, they can induce violent behavior, even maybe some cannibalism if you're crazy enough. As far as inhibiting brain function or messing with your brain chemistry, bath salts definitely are going to mess with your brain chemistry. You're going to go crazy. I put a question mark on this one because nobody has tested out Wade Davis's zombie powder, but probably not. And of course, it's going to fail the zombie test because these things aren't contagious. All right, so this brings us to the best category of zombie types, if you ask me. Pathological type zombies. So this is the third and last class of zombies. It's also the most interesting to me because I'm a biologist. Arguably, there's a fourth class, but we don't discuss them here. Different talk. So pathological zombies are a broad category, but it's basically a form of zombie that might be caused by some sort of biological agent. So a pathogen is any type of compound that's going to make you sick, activate an immune response. So this can include things like viruses, bacteria, prions, parasites, and fungi. All these things are candidates for basically zombie pathogens. Now, some of these we're familiar with, some of them not, so we'll talk a little bit about them as we go through. But viral pathogens is where we're going to start. Oftentimes in a lot of these modern movies, the zombie outbreak is caused by some sort of super virus, making everybody turn into a zombie. Viruses are great because a lot of them can be transmitted easily between humans, so you can spread an infection pretty quickly. They look like these crazy alien landing structures, like out of War of the Worlds, but in essence, they're pretty simple. They have a protein coat, which makes up their body, and inside that bulbous head there, they have a little bit of genetic material. So they land on cells. They're very small, even compared to a bacteria cell. They land on these cells, inject their DNA, and that cell basically uses that DNA to start making more viruses. So of course, when we talk about zombie viruses, the most commonly used virus to describe a possible zombie pathogen is the rabies virus, and for a couple of good reasons. So if we look at the rabies virus, it infects the central nervous system. It can cause anxiety, confusion, hallucinations, even paralysis or numbness in humans. Ultimately, it causes death if you don't treat it in pretty much 100% of the cases. But the cool thing about it is because it's in the central nervous system, it can affect the way the host thinks and behaves. So it causes hosts to be increasingly violent. It also gives them reportedly an irrational fear of water. The violence makes sense. This is a disease that's usually contracted by biting and spread through biting. So by making an animal more violent, it's more likely to bite somebody else and pass that disease on. So it's kind of cool how the way that the virus is able to sort of influence the behavior of some larger creature. And Chuck Norris gives all those traits a thumbs up for rabies as being a good zombie pathogen. And he should know, because when he gets bitten by a zombie, he doesn't turn into a zombie. The zombie turns into Chuck Norris. Can't have a talk without a Chuck Norris joke. Unfortunately, there are some drawbacks to the rabies virus if you're looking to start a zombie plague. Long time between the time you get bitten and the time you start developing symptoms can be up to a year, so it would be a really long zombie movie. It's also minimally contagious, so it's rare to find cases of this in humans, and it's even rarer to get that spread from human to human. Yeah, there's fewer than 2 cases a year, pretty much on average, in the US. And most of the biggest reason because of this is because most of these humans get infected by getting bitten by a dog who has rabies, and we're pretty good about vaccinating our pets here. So we have rabies vaccines in our dogs, so they don't get rabies, they don't pass it on to us. Now we'll come back to rabies virus a little bit later, but for now let's move on to another type of pathogen. So another type of pathogen is bacteria. We're somewhat familiar with bacteria. We've sort of had this long-standing relationship of love-hate with bacteria. If you've never seen them under the microscope, they're pretty fun to look at. They come in all different shapes and sizes. You can even have star-shaped or square-shaped bacteria cells. They're fun. But they come in balls, rods, and this little spiral noodle-looking shape most commonly. They're small single-celled creatures. They are alive. You can find them just about everywhere. If you go outside, pick up a handful of dirt, there's more individual cells of bacteria in there than humans that have ever existed on planet Earth. They live all over the outside of your skin. They live all over the inside of your digestive tract. Most of them are harmless. They actually seem to help you out. They can fight off different diseases and infections by other bacteria and pathogens. A lot of them will help you digest foods you wouldn't be able to digest normally. Yeah, so they're not all bad, but every so often you do get a bad one in the mix. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of our historical diseases have come from. So bacteria have caused plagues like Yersinia pestis, which is the bubonic plague or Black Death, leprosy, tuberculosis, tetanus, botulism. So if you're wondering where the bow comes from in Botox, it's from botulism toxin. You're actually injecting toxin from Clostridium botulinum into your skin. If you inject that into your bloodstream, it can be bad for you. But if you get it in your skin, it tightens up your wrinkles and makes you look plastic. But some people are into it. Cholera, bacterial meningitis, and syphilis are some other plagues that are spread by bacteria as well. And among these, the best candidate for a zombie pathogen in the area of bacteria, I felt was syphilis. And specifically a form of syphilis that occurs through a very advanced stage of syphilis infection. So if you don't treat your syphilis, and I urge you to treat it if you don't have it, you're going to end up with what's called neurosyphilis. And this is basically syphilis, but when it goes to your brain. So syphilis is this little spiral-shaped bacteria over here on the left. It moves throughout your body. It's usually sexually transmitted. By the time it gets to your brain, you're probably having other symptoms, including oozing sores, rashes, hair loss, organ failure, fatigue and numbness. Once it gets to your brain, you're going to have things like poor coordination, paralysis or numbness, so insensitivity to pain, and of course dementia. So this will drive you crazy and ultimately can kill you because it's causing all of your organs to fail at the same time. I like this as a zombie pathogen because you're also getting some bonuses, oozing sores, hair loss. So you can imagine these oozing people sort of stumbling around, with their a sort of zombie type look in their eye, and of course they're crazy. So neurosyphilis I like as a zombie pathogen, so does Rambo. However, there's some drawbacks to this one as well. It's very rare, probably because we can treat it really easily. So penicillin's the go-to for syphilis. It can take a long time to get into your central nervous system, so your brain and spinal cord. So we're talking years, possibly. Like I said, it's usually sexually transmitted, so yeah, if we use neurosyphilis as a zombie pathogen, that would probably change the rating on our zombie movie that we're making. But there's also really poor survival of this thing outside the host as well. So there's some evidence that you can actually contract this from touching some of those oozing sores. But yeah, most of the time it's going to die as soon as it gets outside of the host. And it's not necessarily associated with increased violence. It's a little bit like the all bets are off on the violence part because an individual would be crazy by the time they got infected with this in their brain. But we don't have any evidence of people with neurosyphilis going around attacking people. However, we have potential now for what I call super neurosyphilis, which would be sort of a beefed up version of neurosyphilis that sounds a little bit more like a zombie plague. So basically, like I said, treatment of syphilis is really easy to come by. You just get a bunch of penicillin. That usually takes care of it. But this treatment of syphilis is heavily dependent on antibiotics. You don't develop a sort of immune memory to being infected with syphilis like you do with some other disorders. So if you get syphilis once, you're not immune to it the next time. You have to keep taking antibiotics. And what we've already seen is that overuse of antibiotics in all types of disorders are producing more and more of these antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria. So this is where we get things like MRSA, which is a resistant form of Staphylococcus. There's resistant forms of tuberculosis. So if you get any of these, an infection with any of these microbes, you're basically sort of out of luck as far as antibiotics go. So the antibiotics basically won't have any effect on these types of bacteria. So if we continue to use penicillin, and penicillin is one of the oldest antibiotics out there, it's actually the oldest one we have, so it's been used for the most period of time, we're just basically waiting for a time when we're going to see the emergence of a super strain of syphilis that's resistant to penicillin. And actually, an outbreak of syphilis in China in 2010 was actually isolated and found to be caused by a strain of the syphilis bacterium that was resistant to the second line of antibiotics treatments called macrolides. So luckily, penicillin still worked on these guys. Macrolides didn't, so it might just be a waiting game. In a matter of years, we might see syphilis reemerging as a potential zombie pathogen. Just have to wait and see. All right, so moving on to another form of pathogen, prions. So prions are often used to talk about zombie pathogens as well, mainly because they have a huge effect on your nervous system. They're actually not living things per se. They're misshaped proteins. But these misshaped proteins can be passed on from person to person just like bacteria or viruses. And once they get inside of a person, they make you sick. What they do is they actually cause your healthy proteins to start being misshaped as well. And that's going to be an issue if these proteins are doing things like holding your neurons together in your brain. So yeah, actually, I'm going to pass around a few brains here if you want to take a look at them. There's one real one, one fake one. This one's actually a sheep brain in the jar. But just take a look at it, get an appreciation for sort of the texture of this thing. You can shake the jar. It's obviously sort of gelatinous and soft. They're sort of white in coloration. But this is all basically everything that makes you you. All your memories, all your experiences are stored up in this little package of neurons in here. And what happens when you get an infection with these prions is those prions start breaking apart all those connections you've made. So you end up, instead of a brain, you end up with a head full of mush. And we're all familiar somewhat with some of the symptoms of these prions, because prions cause bovine spongiform encephalopathy, otherwise known as mad cow disease. And so the brains of these cows, if they have mad cow disease, is basically decaying inside their heads. And so obviously they're having neurological problems. They're shaking, losing control of their bowels. They are confused and aggressive. It's pretty depressing. Now, you may or may not have heard that there's prions in humans as well. There are. And one of the best instances, or I guess in an academic sense, of prions in humans comes from the disease Kuru. Kuru was a disease that's pretty rare to find nowadays, but they first noticed it as affecting a very specific tribe of people in Papua New Guinea called the Kore people. And Kuru was caused by a prion. And like the cows, it infected the nervous system of these individuals. And you started seeing symptoms of these people who had this disorder having tremors, having problems with coordination. They would shake. And in late stages, they would even start laughing and crying uncontrollably. They weren't having a good time. It wasn't a joke. It's just that their brain was having problems processing the information around them. So it was a devastating disorder. And as you can see on the right here, I have a picture of a healthy brain slice over here. A brain on the left is a human brain that's been infected with the prion disease that caused Kuru. Notice that you're basically losing a lot of this white matter here. So you're losing all these neurons that would be responsible for not only storing up your memories and higher brain functions, but also modulating things like your emotions and your muscle coordination too. So it's sort of like wasting away inside your head, very depressing. But of course, you're going to get all these side effects of neurological disorder as well. So twitching, tremors. The good thing about Kuru, if you're us and not the Kore people, is that these prions seem to be only transmissible by ingestion. So cows were getting it because they were being fed ground up cow brains in their feed. Not sure why they do that, but it was a bad call. And the humans in this Kore tribe, they had a tradition of basically ingesting the bodies of their deceased friends. So they would eat the brains and the spinal cords and, of course, ingest the prions from their friends, and then these prions would start affecting their brains as well. So yeah, it's largely sort of been phased out. As soon as we discovered this, basically we outlawed this practice, and it largely fell out of popularity as well because the people who practiced it tended to die. However, it took a long time to sort of go extinct because it took possibly up to 10 years before you'd start actually having symptoms from the time you actually ate a diseased brain. So sad, but again, not very good side effects for a zombie apocalypse. It's not going to be very popular. It's not going to be spread very easily unless you're going around eating brains of zombies. All right, which brings us to our last category of biological pathogens here, pathological zombies. Parasites, and this is really the most exciting category of possible zombie pathogens because it includes so much stuff and they're so interesting. So parasites are amazing. They're basically anything that lives on or inside of another creature. They can include single-celled creatures. They can include multicellular creatures, worms, insects or arthropods, protists, all different types of creatures can be parasites. And parasitism, we tend to think of it as a weird thing because we're not parasites. But really, it's the most common form of life on the planet. So most of life, probably close to about 3/4 of life on the planet, exists as a parasite. So it lives inside something or onside something else. Free living species like humans, we really only make up about 1/4 of the species on the planet. However, that's what we're the most familiar with, so we tend to ignore parasites in day-to-day life unless they make us sick. So most parasites are going to make you sick, cause some sort of disorder. However, there's a lot of research suggesting that parasites can actually be used for some sort of medical treatment, so they might actually help you out. A lot of worms are being researched, so things like tapeworms and hookworms and things like that might infect you. They're part of a family of worms that may actually secrete anti-inflammatory cytokines. So these are chemicals that basically decrease inflammation in your body. So being infected with one of these might actually decrease autoimmune disorders or even help you with your seasonal allergies, which are caused by overinflammation. Parasites also tend to compete with anything else living in your body, so they might secrete antibiotics for you, help kill some bacterial viral cells as well. And of course, like I always like to point out in my classes, they used to be sold quite popularly as a weight loss supplement. So you could go down to your GNC and buy some tapeworms, ingest them. They would of course grow inside your digestive system, and they would help you eat some of the food that you ingest. So not 100% of your calories would go towards your body. Some of that would go to growing a larger and larger tapeworm, which is gross, but an effective way of losing weight. And an interesting thing to point out is that all multicellular creatures are susceptible to parasitism. It's not just a human thing. It's not just an ant thing. Whatever, if you've got more than one cell, then you can have a single-celled parasite or larger living inside you.
Your tapeworm probably has parasites inside of it.
It likely does. There are things called hyperparasites and hyperparasitoids, which actually are parasites of parasites. That's a different talk, though. So basically, when we go through these parasites, there's a lot of work that's been done on looking at potential zombie parasites because a lot of them have to regulate the complex host brain to regulate the host behavior. So they live inside one host, but oftentimes they need to get to a different host or outside that host in order to complete their life cycle. So these parasites, besides doing things like secreting anti-inflammatories, they may also secrete compounds that change the way you think and behave. So this is typically what's meant when we talk about zombie parasites. Basically any parasite that can change the behavioral or brain function of a host. And we see evidence of it almost everywhere that we look. So parasites of invertebrates is where we're going to start. Invertebrates are simpler than humans, but they're widespread. Most of the creatures on this planet are invertebrates. Vertebrates don't make up that much creatures. As far as species diversity goes, it includes things like insects and arthropods, so crabs, sea stars, cnidarians like jellies and the such, sea urchins. Any of these things that don't have a backbone, they're all considered invertebrates. And as such, they can actually get a lot of parasites. One of the more common ones you come across, if you follow the groups I do on Facebook, is the zombie ant fungus called cordyceps. Cordyceps is a fungus that is actually a parasite that controls the brain function of ants. So fairly simple brain, but still functional nonetheless. So the cordyceps fungus is shown here as these little mushrooms sort of bubbling out from the ant carcass there. They don't just cannibalize the ant. Before they actually spring forth from its head and use the ant for nutrients, they actually control the ant's brain and cause it to do stuff like leave the colony or climb up to a height of about 25 centimeters off the ground of the forest that they live in. Once it gets that high, it's in basically the optimal range for growing cordyceps fungus. It's just the right humidity. The ant latches on with its mandibles to the plant, and then the ant dies. And then the cordyceps erupts from its body. So luckily for you, I've got a cool video that's going to sort of mimic this process. One cool thing about infection with the fungus is that the ants, their friends who aren't infected, they can basically tell when an ant starts evidencing symptoms of infection. So this ant is affected with the cordyceps spores. He's trying to go about his daily work, and one of his friends is actually going to find him here in a second. And when they find an individual who's infected, they pick him up and they take him as far away from the hive as they can, and they drop him off so that he doesn't spread the infection to the rest of the nest here. So yeah, once this ant is basically There's his friend carrying him off. He's kicking him to the curb. And yeah, then he's going to climb up to get just above the forest floor to a good spot for cordyceps to grow, latches on and dies. And if you look at the back of his head, you can start to see the cordyceps fungus basically growing out of this ant's head. So it was in his brain. It caused a change in chemical signals in there. But yeah, it's impressive that even in a simple creature like this, a fungus can basically control complex behavior. So the ant has to know that it needs to leave the colony, it needs to know that it needs to climb up to the right height, and it needs to know to latch on right there in order for this fungus to basically erupt from its head. The fungus then produces what's called fruiting bodies, which drop spores everywhere underneath. So this is the reason why his friends take him away from the hive when he's there. And it spreads very quickly. And yeah, it can wipe out entire populations of ants or whatever invertebrates it happens to be affecting. All right, so now let's get to some worms. So besides the fungus, yeah, one of these zombie parasites that often gets talked about is the horsehair worm or Gordian worm. These worms are impressive for a couple reasons. One, they control the brain function of crickets that they infect. Another thing that's impressive about them is their length. So these things can get a foot or more in length. And that's a lot of worm to be packed in such a tiny cricket. And there's been anecdotal stories told about crickets that have 10, 20 of these worms emerging from them. So the thing that this does to the crickets is it gets into their brains. Once it's in there, it's got a nice cozy area to start growing. But the bad part about being in a cricket is this worm needs to basically get to a water source in order to complete its life cycle. So that's where it does its basically mating and yeah, where it wants to get. Crickets don't swim. So what it does in the brain is it motivates the cricket to basically drown itself. Now it does this in a sort of complex way, but it's going to cause the cricket to be attracted to bright lights. Normally crickets are actually repulsed by bright lights. And scientists think that it's basically the reflection of things like the moon or sun off of a body of water like a pond or a river that actually attracts the crickets to the water. And the crickets then hop right in. Like I said, crickets can't swim, so they just drown. So sometimes they're called suicide crickets. And then once they're in there, the fun part begins. The parasite can actually sense that it's submerged in water, and it starts getting out of the cricket. I love the music to this one, too. And like I said, these can be very long worms. And they're fun to watch. This one's actually got a couple ones in there coming out. Yeah, you imagine how confusing this must be for the cricket. At least this one's not drowning. But the cool part is we actually have a similar thing that happens in humans as well. So if any of you have ever heard of the fiery serpent parasite, it's technically called Dracunculus. You can find it in South America. Dracunculus is a worm, a lot like this creature. But Dracunculus, instead of getting to the brain of the human, when you're infected with Dracunculus, it also needs to find its way to water, but it basically just secretes chemicals that cause intense burning in anywhere that it's taken up residence in the human body. So usually it finds its way into your foot or lower leg. It causes intense burning there until you submerge that in water, and once you do that, a similar thing happens. This worm crawls its way out of your leg. Yeah, it forms this little sore with a little hole in the top, and it sort of just wiggles its way really slowly out of the tip. You can actually extract those things. You have to be really careful about it, because if you go too fast, it breaks, and then the rest of that parasite can regenerate inside your body. So a lot of times the traditional way to extract it is to take a little cross stick. You wrap the end of the worm around it when it starts to protrude. So you stick your leg in water, it starts coming out. You wrap it around the end of the stick. And then over the period of about a week, you slowly crank that stick to pull out these worms. And in humans, they can get a meter or longer in length if it's a female of the worm. And actually, so this treatment and affliction are so old that it's actually thought to possibly be the reason that our sign for medicine today is sort of a cross stick with a two-headed snake wrapped around it. They think that possibly that was derived from these worms wrapped around these crossed sticks. So a very early medical treatment. All right, so we're still in invertebrates. Probably the master of invertebrate parasites is this guy right here. So the emerald cockroach wasp, he gets a lot of press because he's really beautiful. It's not a single-celled worm. He's not that gross. Wasps technically aren't parasites. They're what's called parasitoids because they're not quite parasites, but for our purposes, they still control the brains of other creatures and get them to do their bidding. And as what you're going to see here in a minute is an emerald wasp in action. Now, the emerald wasp is amazing. It stings the head of a unsuspecting cockroach there. It doesn't kill the cockroach. You can see he's not running away. His sting is actually so precise and with such a perfectly designed chemical, it basically inhibits the motivational center of the roach's brain. So he's alive, completely aware of what's going on. He just lacks the motivation to run away from this wasp. So the wasp grabs its antennas, drags it to its den. Once it's in there, the wasp lays her eggs inside of the body of the roach in very actually strategic spots so that the roach stays alive as long as possible while her young hatch out and then cannibalize, or it's not cannibalism, but it eats the roach from the inside out. Then her babies will burst from the roach. All right, so those are all invertebrates that are being controlled by parasites. What about vertebrates? They're a little bit more complex. These are things with spinal cords, including humans, also dogs, cats, mice, lizards, rodents, and fish, things that we have a little bit more day-to-day interaction with. And yeah, there's tons of examples of parasites in these creatures, and it's even more impressive what they can do because they have such a more biologically complex creature to try to control. What we see here is a lancet liver fluke. This is a good starting point because he actually moves between hosts to complete his life cycle. Some of those hosts are vertebrates, some of them are invertebrates. So he would agree with the statement, it's not life that's complicated, it's the struggle to guide and control life. But a pretty amazing parasite. So you can see he starts his life, like the name suggests, in the liver of these cows, so a vertebrate species. However, it can only go so far in there. Its eggs basically have to get into a different host. So they're shed from the cow and the feces, eaten by snails. Snails regurgitate them. Ants then eat those regurgitated pellets. And then it infects the brains of ants. And there it influences the brain of the ants, causes them, again, to climb up vegetation. They stand on the edge of these tall blades of grass, which increases their likelihood that they're going to get eaten by a cow, and the life cycle continues. Beautiful circle of life. So yeah, that's a parasite whose life is very complex. It's got to work its way through 3 different species in order to get a successful life cycle. What about one that infects other vertebrates? This is Euhaplorchus californiensis, another a little parasite. This one actually infects 2 vertebrate species, birds and fish. It starts off life in the birds. Its spores, basically eggs are shed by the birds and the feces, eaten by snails. Fish ingest these. It then works its way from the fish stomach and gills. It works its way up to the fish brain. Once it's in the fish brain, it starts modifying that fish behavior. What it does is actually decreases serotonin levels, increases dopamine levels. But this messes with the fish's muscle control. It causes the fish to basically thrash around violently. This causes its likelihood of being eaten by a bird to raise to about 50-fold. So it basically increases its likelihood that it's going to get eaten, and then this little guy can continue his life cycle. And this brings us to probably the champion of vertebrate parasites, a little guy called Toxoplasma gondii. He's a single-celled protist here. Sometimes they call him Toxo. This is what he looks like. This guy exists in cats. He does much of his life in cats, but every so often his eggs find their way into a mouse, and that's a problem because he really likes cats. He's a cat person, or a cat parasite, I suppose. And so it works its way into the brain of mice and starts messing around with the brain chemistry of the mouse. It causes the mouse instead of be afraid of the smell of cat urine to actually be attracted to the scent of cat urine. This causes the mouse, of course, to seek out areas where there's lots of cats and get eaten by a cat. Once it gets eaten by a cat, the parasite can then fulfill its life inside the cat and continue that circle of life. So this is great evidence that a single-celled protist is able to control the behavior of something as complex as a mammal. So it's a mammal, it's a vertebrate, it's similar to us. We share about 95% of our genes with mice. We're not all that similar. So people started asking the question of what happens if this parasite works its way into a human? And as you can see by this little flow chart, sometimes these oocysts don't find their way into the mice. they find their way into humans. So especially if you have cats and you're changing a litter box, it's something to think about. Maybe wash your hands afterwards. But it turns out that, yeah, it looks like toxoplasma in the human brain can have some effects on human behavior. So these are all so far correlations. So nobody's shown a cause and effect between these. But it looks like there's increased correlation between people who are affected with toxoplasma in their brain and certain personality types. So personality tests will tend to show people scoring certain ways if you're infected with this parasite. Cognitive defects, it's also associated with increased vehicular accidents and neurological disorders as well. So you find more people with schizophrenia and bipolar that have this disorder or that have this parasite than healthy people. And like I said, the scary part about this one is we deal with cats on a regular basis, and these eggs basically are being spread by the cats. And it's estimated that among humans, there's about 30% to 60% chance that humans actually have toxoplasma in their brain, and you might not even know it. So next time you're in a vehicle accident, maybe think about getting a brain biopsy and searching for toxoplasma. You might be able to sue somebody, maybe a kitty litter company. So yeah, if you look around this room, there's a great chance that at least one of us, but probably more, already has this parasite inside of us. All right, so if we look at the category of pathological zombies as a whole, one of the reasons I love this category is because you have everything that you need for a zombie apocalypse. Certain pathogens are going to make you violent and maybe even cannibalistic. You can have increased or an effect on your behavior. So some of these pathogens are going to influence your thinking and cause you to do things maybe against your own free will. And of course, they're pathogenic, so by definition, they can be spread around. So you get sort of everything in this category, which is great. And one thing I forgot to pass around, I'm going to go ahead and pass around now. Should have passed this one around while we were doing the worm videos. This is not Dracunculus, but this is Ascaris. This is actually specifically a species of this worm that parasitizes humans. You can find versions of this worm in pigs or humans. It will actually grow inside your intestines. Pay attention to how long this thing is. It'll start to form these clumps. It can actually kill you because it'll start absorbing some of the nutrients you eat and can cause an intestinal blockage. So I've got this one in a clear jar. This one's sort of packed inside this tube, so it's a little harder to see, but one nice thing is that you can imagine this is your intestine, and this clump of worms is starting to grow, and imagine all the problems you might have with that guy in there. All right. So it may come as no surprise to you that a biologist found that the most likely candidate for a zombie outbreak would probably come from a biological source. So you may be asking yourself, where are the real movie zombies? So sure, a lot of these pathogens have some of the attributes of we associate with zombies, but nothing really 100% recapitulates a movie zombie or a zombie movie or a zombie apocalypse. Well, let me tell you, it is coming. They may not be here yet, but we have technology and a lot of weird people out there. So in the near future, you may see papers being published about how to build a better zombie or a better zombie pathogen. For the first time as a species, we actually have the ability to use gene editing technology. So we can change our own DNA. We can change the DNA of anything that has DNA fairly simply and very accurately. So we use a type of technology called CRISPR. It's been all over the news. You can fix broken genes. You can plug in new genes. It's going to revolutionize the way we treat a lot of genetic disorders, as well as any disorder that really has some sort of a biological component to it. So CRISPR is going to be a great thing for medicine, but you could also use CRISPR to do other things like create a zombie pathogen. So if we go back to what I felt like was the closest thing that came to recapitulating what we see in movies, the rabies virus. It's got all these great things that we associate with zombies, confusion, aggression, even maybe increased biting tendencies, which would be awesome, spread by bite. But it had a few drawbacks. We could potentially correct those drawbacks using CRISPR method. People have talked about this. It's been the basis of movies in the past. There's been things like the hypothetical rage virus put out there. In essence, you'd start with a zombies virus and start messing around with its DNA to change its properties. So one of the things that was a shortcoming of rabies was the long incubation time, so the long period between the time you're infected and when you start developing symptoms. Well, the good news is we could basically use CRISPR to identify the genes that control basically the latency of that period and delete them or change them to versions where that would cause the rabies virus to make symptoms occur faster. So we wouldn't even have to borrow from any other species. We could just change the genes that were already in rabies. We could also steal genes from things like the flu virus to increase the transmissibility of rabies. So we wouldn't have to rely potentially on just bites to spread this around. We could steal genes from the flu that makes it airborne. So if you coughed on somebody, they could turn into a zombie. And just for accuracy, we could also throw in some genes from the Ebola virus. Ebola caused you to bleed out of different orifices. So by throwing this into our rage virus, it really would lend some authenticity to this disease. So now it's transmissible. You get symptoms very quickly, so you would turn into a zombie very quickly, and you'd be bleeding all over the place, which would be gross. So I think that would probably be the best way to create a zombie apocalypse. It hasn't happened yet. This is all hypothetical work, but in the future, there's definitely people thinking about this. And the scary thing about CRISPR technology is, like it says at the bottom, it's so popular and so simple that minimal education is basically required to do this. You can buy CRISPR kits online starting as cheap as $140. Somebody was telling me, some of my students were saying that they found reviews of some of these products about people using some of this technology in their basements, stuff like that. But it's fairly simple. The creator of the CRISPR technology has asked for sort of a voluntary moratorium on using CRISPR in humans. But anything else is pretty much fair game. So of course, this has got a lot of people a little bit nervous. You don't want high school kids buying these kits on Amazon and creating their own custom virus. But luckily for us, it's a little bit harder than I'm making it sound right here. So there are some limits to what you can do with viruses. But of course, if you overcome any of those issues, we would have a zombie explosion on our hand. And it wouldn't have to be rabies virus. Like I said, you can modify anything with DNA. So you can modify syphilis, create your own custom strain of super neurosyphilis, or your own super parasite even if you wanted to, super toxoplasma. All right, so what's the point? If we're all going to die in this slow decay of society during the zombie apocalypse, why do we even talk about it? Why is it so interesting to us? Well, I would posit that it's because it makes us nervous about the future that it's actually a benefit to our species. So a lot of things that we've done as a species have been motivated by fear. So the fear of starving to death has basically led us to do things like domesticate crops, domesticate animals. The fear of basically dying prematurely from some easily curable disease has led us to commercialize antibiotics, revolutionize medicine. We're really good at keeping people alive for long periods of time. So fear is not a bad thing, especially when it's motivating you to do something good as a species. So I would argue that zombies, because they're so inherent in our psychology and in our culture, they're a great force for change. And yeah, I think they're going to, they're already starting to stimulate a lot of scientific discussions and scientific interest into technologies that maybe are either inspired by zombies or inspired to help us survive a zombie apocalypse. And we're seeing fruits of these studies already in academic circles. There's, people who study genetics have found that there's actually subsets of genes that become active after organisms die. So even after death, 24 hours, 48 hours later, you have certain genes that are actually turning on in your body. Everything's not turning off. Now there's some debate about what these genes are actually doing to the human, but it's interesting to know this. And what they've learned from these, besides changing our definition of maybe clinical death in individuals, it actually seems like what we're learning is going to help us retain organs longer, also help recipients of organ transplants maybe not have to take so many immunosuppressant drugs so they don't reject their transplants. It may also help forensic scientists pinpoint time of death a little bit better. We've also learned a lot about the metabolomics of death. So what happens to your metabolism while you die? And this has actually opened up a whole nother field of study. How can we basically mimic some of these phenotypes associated with metabolic death in live tissue? And so this has led us to find ways to achieve what we call suspended animation in humans and in human tissues. It's not only applicable to things like long-term space travel, which might require us to travel for lots of years before we get to a new star system or something like that. This is technology that can be used tomorrow if it becomes available to basically help patients stop bleeding to death So if you get shot, you can go inject yourself with a pen that causes suspended animation, wait till somebody comes along, picks you up, revives you, and patches up your wounds. It can help patients undergoing pretty complicated surgeries. It helps us basically sedate them for longer periods of time without adverse effects as well. And of course, the ultimate technology here is basically overcoming death itself. So far, we're not able to keep organisms alive indefinitely. We also can't reanimate dead tissue, but we're getting fairly close. So we can actually create new life forms from previously non-living matter. So synthetic biology is giving us the technology to sort of create our own custom life forms by writing DNA code on a computer, putting it into basically a plasma membrane, and letting it run its thing. We also are learning a lot more about how the body ages, what happens to your metabolism not only when you die but as you get older, and trying to reverse those effects. So anti-aging technology is largely associated with a fear of death and a fear of getting old. Rejuvenation has been a hot field lately. We've found a lot of compounds that look like they can actually turn back the hands of time. And if you have old muscle tissue or an old brain, you can maybe take injections of these compounds and get the brain of a 20-year-old, get the muscle of a 20-year-old, and possibly keep these attributes indefinitely. So rejuvenation, very hot topic, and probably motivated a little bit, at least by our fear of death. Maybe in the future we'll have actually immortal humans as well, which would be pretty awesome. So a lot of cool stuff coming out of possibly a zombie-inspired science. Yeah, in conclusion here, I guess I want to end with a uplifting statement. We talked a lot about, zombie pathogens and the zombie apocalypse, and I talked a little bit about it basically being sort of a coping mechanism of a dark future that we sort of tell this story to ourselves to feel better. But it's not bad to be afraid of zombies. Like I said, fear is a good motivator, and as long as it's stimulating your interest, and that interest is causing us to find some of these discoveries like the ones I just talked about, it's perfectly all right to be afraid of zombies. And if you showed up at this talk because you have an interest in zombies, and you ended up learning one or two things today that you can drop at parties, that's great. You've already taken the first step in sort of a larger journey. I just want to encourage you all, whatever you're interested in, whether it's zombies or not, keep following that interest. It'll lead you weird places. You may end up giving a talk up here one of these days on werewolves or whatever your fetish is. But keep following your interests. Keep asking questions, especially to your professors, so they can end up here giving good talks to you as well. And yeah, hopefully in the future we won't have a zombie apocalypse, but if we do, I'm glad you'll be part of that, whether you're a victim or you're a survivor. You can always say I told you so, but yeah, we look forward to basically having scientists like you who ask hard questions and interesting questions in the sciences. So yeah, thanks for being here, and I'll take any of the questions you got yeah, whenever you want to. And I've got a few more things to touch up here as well. Do make sure I get my brains back. I brought an anti-zombie tool as well if I need to use it. Otherwise, thank you.
Are there any questions from the audience for Dr. Pawlus?
Well, I do have one question. Do you have any record of people going to the doctor's office after one of your presentations?
I don't. I would be interested to see if the types of parasites you have on you motivates how you react to these talks, though. Definitely, hopefully everyone goes home and at least you can take away from this that wash your hands after you change your kitty litter box. All right, well, if you want to, oh, yeah, another question?
About 3 or 4 weeks ago, the local radio station here had, you were talking about the cats.
Oh, yeah.
And they had about a half-hour program on that with the National Health Advisor.
Mm-hmm.
It was talking about how you should wash your hands every time you clean a litter box or something like that. Have they found any medication that will actually destroy that parasite?
Yeah, I mean, you can kill this parasite if you want to. Most places actually don't even treat it because people don't usually go in with any symptoms. You don't realize you have this in your brain, unless you go and specifically get it checked. If you do get it checked and you find it's in there, you can take medications to get rid of it. But yeah, like I said, everything that they're associating with toxo in the human brain, it's all just correlative right now, so we don't know that it's actually causing any of these things. We probably will figure that out at some point in the future. And if it is found to have a causative role, then you can bet there'll be better treatment strategies to get rid of this guy, because people don't want to feel like they're being sort of piloted by this little single-celled creature. Yeah.
Do you think it might make you want to buy more cats?
Yeah, possibly. I think that's a fascinating area to research, is how much of our behavior is actually being influenced by parasites. Like I said, not only toxoplasma, but all the bacteria that live inside of us. Are any of those secreting molecules that are changing how our brain thinks in order to get us to do things that we feel like we need to do things because we like to do them, but maybe we're doing them because in some way it helps this life form sort of complete its life cycle or reproduce. Yeah.
In my opinion, I'd have to say that the best disease for us to modify for a zombie apocalypse would be the influenza virus, mainly because it's so transmissible, and two, if you could speed up the process to how it would be transmitted, you could get it to everybody on the planet within 24 hours.
Yeah, it's definitely, flu is a great model of a virus that can basically spread very quickly. And we've had it historically in the past, like 1918 flu epidemic that swept through the world. You can imagine if instead of making you have the flu and eventually killing you, if before it killed you, it made you violent or caused you to attack people. That basically would be the zombie apocalypse. So if you can identify the genes that trigger violence in the host, maybe from the rabies virus, you could steal some of those genes, put them in the flu virus for sure, with CRISPR technology, and yeah, just make it worse.
Or you can just alter the influenza virus to target specifically the functions inside our brain.
Yeah, if you were a good enough molecular biologist, you could definitely engineer a virus that only infected or preferentially infected certain spots of your brain, so maybe the ones that would control your behavior or aggression, and maybe cause them to release more hormones, or maybe cause it to attach maybe to or attack your adrenal glands to give you a surge of adrenaline, maybe cause you to be sort of like World War Z zombies, where you're sprinting around and jumping from rooftops and things like that before you die. But yeah, it's fascinating. And the flu traditionally, I mean, it's a great model of not only a fast-spreading pathogen, but it's also one that's hard to treat. So we have to get a flu vaccination every year because we're bad at making a vaccine that can catch every type of flu out there. So the chances are, if you or somebody else created a zombie strain of flu, we probably would be defenseless against it, because the flu cycles through its surface antigen so quickly. We don't right now have a good virus or a good vaccine that can protect against every strain of flu out there. So yeah, we'd probably all be susceptible to it. All right. Well, if you want any more questions, feel free to come up and talk to me. I've got a few more specimens floating around here if you want to see something dead in a jar. Otherwise, yeah, grab some snacks, and thanks for coming.